$500 million. That was the number Judge Clarence Thomas hurled across the courtroom like a gavel meant to crush not just a woman, but a voice. The headline blared across tickers and phone screens within minutes. Thomas fines Jasmine Crockett $500 million. The room froze. Reporters scrambled to capture the moment, some gasping audibly as the figure left his lips. $500 million, not for a corporation, not for a billionaire oil tycoon, but for one congresswoman who had dared to challenge his authority. It wasn't justice. It was spectacle. It was punishment dressed up in legal robes. The marble pillars of the chamber seemed to echo the absurdity of it. Even seasoned analysts whispered that the fine wasn't just unprecedented, it was surreal, almost theatrical in its cruelty. Cameras zoomed in on Thomas's face, cold, unflinching, a mask of authority untouched by conscience. And then they cut to Jasmine Crockett sitting still, shoulders squared, lips pressed into the kind of silence that doesn't break but builds. The symbolism hit harder than the number itself. This wasn't just about money. It was about power flexing against defiance, about an establishment figure using the weight of the system to grind down a woman who dared to speak truth. To many, the fine felt like a declaration of war, an attempt to bankrupt dignity, to scare anyone who might follow in her footsteps. Social feeds lit up instantly. $500 million? That's not a ruling, that's a threat. This isn't justice, this is intimidation. Hashtags erupted. #stand with Crockett, #Thomas exposed as people everywhere felt the insult burn like it was personal. Because in a way, it was. Every immigrant kid, every working mother, every person who ever felt small in the shadow of unchecked power saw themselves in that moment. And still, Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. The cameras searched her for tears, for panic, for fear. But her eyes told another story, one not of defeat, but of calculation. She was not the prey in this narrative. She was waiting. Because what happened next didn't just shatter the silence in that room, a broken bar, it shook Clarence Thomas to his core. But what Crockett did next left even Clarence Thomas stunned. A broken bar. The silence after Thomas's pronouncement was deafening, broken only by the clatter of reporters' keyboards and the faint hum of cameras zooming in for the shot. A $500 million fine wasn't just a legal ruling, it was a declaration. It was meant to send a message that dissent would be crushed with the heaviest hand imaginable. And yet, what made the moment so explosive wasn't only the size of the number, it was what that number represented. For decades, Clarence Thomas had been shielded by robes, by precedent, by institutions that treated him as untouchable. But here, in this instant, he wasn't ruling against some faceless entity. He was targeting a woman who had already become a lightning rod in American politics, Jasmine Crockett. The stakes stretched far beyond the courtroom. If Thomas could bury a sitting member of Congress under an impossible financial penalty, then who was safe? What message did that send to activists, to lawmakers, to ordinary citizens watching at home? It told them, speak out, and you will be crushed. But that very arrogance became the spark that lit the fire. Within hours, anchors across networks scrambled to interpret the ruling. Legal experts shook their heads in disbelief, calling it punitive, retaliatory, almost medieval. On social media, the ruling was instantly memeified. Images of Thomas clutching dollar bills like a cartoon villain spread like wildfire. The absurdity of the figure made it impossible to ignore and impossible to respect. Still, behind the headlines and hashtags, a deeper truth simmered. To many, this wasn't just about Clarence Thomas versus Jasmine Crockett. It was about power versus principle. The fine itself was ludicrous, but the principle was deadly serious. Could one man, propped up by wealth and influence, silence a woman whose only weapon was her voice? And Crockett's voice was not the kind to fade. She had already built a reputation for speaking truth to power in committee hearings, dismantling bad faith arguments with precision and fire. She was known for the sharp, unflinching tone that cut through the noise of Washington spin. The very traits that made her dangerous to the establishment were the traits Thomas sought to stamp out with one sweeping ruling. But here's what he miscalculated: you can fine someone $500 million, but you cannot fine their resolve. You cannot bankrupt their courage. And in the hours following that ruling, as pundits speculated about appeals and legal loopholes, something else began to take shape. Support, energy, outrage transforming into solidarity. Jasmine Crockett, seated calmly in that chamber, wasn't just defending herself. She had unwittingly become a symbol for every person tired of corruption, for every voice that felt smothered by institutions, for every woman told she was too loud, too angry, or too unapologetic. The stakes had been raised to the breaking point, and America was holding its breath to see if she would bend or if she would rise. And rise she did. Because while Clarence Thomas had his gavel, Jasmine Crockett had something far more dangerous. The truth, sharpened by lived experience, and delivered with the kind of clarity that couldn't be ignored. Her silence in that room wasn't weakness. It was the stillness before a storm. And when the storm broke, it would change everything. Because what she was about to unleash would ripple far beyond the courtroom, a broken bar long before the gavel slammed down with that staggering $500 million fine. Clarence Thomas had been building a legacy, not one of justice and fairness, but of shadow, scandal, and suspicion. His name carried the weight of the Supreme Court, yet whispered beneath it were stories of luxury trips, billionaire benefactors, and ethical lines crossed so many times they blurred into invisibility. To his allies, Thomas was a stalwart conservative, a figure who embodied resistance to progress. To his critics, he was the very image of institutional rot, cloaked in authority but dripping with hypocrisy. And in this case, against Jasmine Crockett, the arrogance of that hypocrisy was on full display. For decades, Americans had asked, how does a man earning a public servant's salary end up flying on private jets, vacationing on yachts, mingling with billionaires as if they were family? Investigations revealed the gifts, the trips, the perks that piled up like trophies of power. And yet, each time questions surfaced, Thomas brushed them aside with a shrug, shielded by the very system designed to hold him accountable. He was untouchable, or so he believed. This belief, this aura of invincibility, is what made that $500 million fine feel less like justice and more like vengeance. Clarence Thomas had grown accustomed to a world where his word was law, where his robe was armor, where no one, not the press, not his peers, not even public outrage, could puncture his shield. But arrogance has a way of blinding men to their own downfall. Consider the irony: a man who accepted lavish favors from billionaires without blinking, turning around to punish a woman with a fine so astronomical it could bankrupt nations. What did that say about balance, about fairness, about the scales of justice he was sworn to uphold? And perhaps that was the point. The fine wasn't just meant to punish Jasmine Crockett. It was meant to humiliate her, to make her small, to remind anyone watching that Thomas, with all his years on the bench, still wielded a power few dared to challenge. But history has a way of reframing villains. The arrogance that once made Thomas untouchable was precisely what began to expose him. Each new report about gifts, about secret connections, about rulings that seemed all too convenient for his benefactors, chipped away at the myth of integrity. And when the fine against Crockett hit the airwaves, millions of Americans didn't see a justice at work. They saw a man grasping, overreaching, showing the very weakness he tried so hard to conceal. Because here's the truth: corruption always overplays its hand. The powerful, when desperate, push too far. And that's when the cracks widen. For years, Thomas had avoided the spotlight of accountability, slipping past the outrage with the help of allies and institutions unwilling to confront him. But in going after Crockett, he did something different. He picked a fight with someone who wasn't afraid of him, someone who wasn't cowed by titles or robes or the weight of tradition. And this was his mistake. As Americans scrolled through headlines that week, they didn't just see Jasmine Crockett under fire. They saw Clarence Thomas exposed, a man whose fine was less about law and more about fear. Fear of being challenged. Fear of losing control. Fear of a truth teller armed with nothing but her voice. That fear bled through in the ruling itself. Because only fear drives a man to swing wildly, to punish disproportionately, to make the kind of move that reveals more about himself than about his target. And so, while Thomas may have thought he was tightening his grip on power, he was, in fact, loosening it. The fine wasn't a display of strength. It was a confession of weakness. But the most devastating part, he didn't know it yet. Because what Clarence Thomas underestimated was Jasmine Crockett herself. He saw her as an opponent to crush, not as a force to reckon with. He thought a number A, however ludicrous, however impossible, would silence her. He was wrong. And history would remember this not as the moment Thomas reasserted his dominancy, a broken bar, but as the moment Jasmine Crockett began to dismantle it. And just when he thought no one dared to confront him, a broken bar, he met Jasmine Crockett. If Clarence Thomas's story was one of power accumulated in shadows, Jasmine Crockett's was one of light carved out of struggle. Her rise was not built on billionaire favors or closed-door deals, but on grit that began far from the marble pillars of Washington. Jasmine Crockett grew up not with the silver spoon of privilege, but with the sharpened edge of reality. She knew the sting of being underestimated, the weight of carrying identity in spaces designed to silence it. Where others were groomed for elite institutions, she had to fight her way through one exam, one bill, one barrier at a time. Her first battleground was not the House chamber but the courtroom of everyday people. As a public defender, she saw faces the system had already written off: the young man caught in a cycle of poverty and crime, the single mother fighting charges born more of circumstance than intent, the immigrant staring down a justice system that barely recognized their humanity. And Jasmine didn't just represent them, she fought for them as if their stories were her own. Because in many ways, they were. That fire made her dangerous to the establishment. She didn't speak in carefully packaged sound bites designed to appease donors. She spoke with raw conviction, with the cadence of someone who knew struggle firsthand. And the people noticed. Her voice cut through the noise because it wasn't polished, it was real. It was this fire that carried her into politics. Running for office wasn't about ambition for Jasmine. It was about necessity. She saw how laws were written not for the people she defended, but against them. She saw how the system perpetuated the very inequalities she spent her days battling in court. And so, she stepped into the arena. Washington was not ready for her. In a city addicted to polite corruption, Jasmine Crockett was disruptive. She was unapologetic in committee hearings, refusing to yield even when her colleagues tried to shout her down. She turned hearings into viral moments, dismantling bad faith arguments with sharp precision, her words ricocheting across Twitter timelines and TikTok feeds. To her supporters, she became a symbol of what unfiltered truth sounded like. To her enemies, she was a problem, a voice too loud, too bold, too uncontainable. But Jasmine knew what it was like to be underestimated. And she knew that every insult hurled her way, every attempt to silence her, only confirmed she was hitting the right nerve. The moment Clarence Thomas decided to slap her with a $500 million fine, he wasn't just targeting Jasmine Crockett the politician. He was targeting everything she represented: other people in courtrooms without power, the voices shut out of legislative halls, the generations told to wait their turn while injustice flourished unchecked. And that's why she didn't flinch. Her stillness in that chamber was not fear, it was recognition. She understood the stakes, understood that this was bigger than her bank account, bigger than her career. This was about the message sent to millions watching. Would she bow, or would she stand? Because Jasmine Crockett had already been tempered by fire. She had walked into rooms where the odds were stacked against her and refused to break. Every challenge, every dismissal, every attempt to silence her had only sharpened her resolve. And in that moment, before the cameras, facing down a Supreme Court justice with centuries of institutional power at his back, she summoned that same fire. What Thomas didn't understand was this: Jasmine was not just a woman with a microphone. She was the embodiment of a movement that spanned far beyond the walls of any courtroom. Her rise had been fueled by communities that knew the sting of corruption, the weight of inequality, and the ache of silence. She carried them all with her, and she wasn't about to put them down. So when Thomas tried to crush her with numbers, Jasmine Crockett understood what was really at play. He wasn't striking her alone. He was striking at the millions who believed in what she stood for. And if she yielded, they would all feel the loss. But she didn't yield. Because Jasmine Crockett knew something Clarence Thomas didn't. True power doesn't come from money, from robes, from titles. True power comes from truth, from authenticity, from the courage to stand unshaken even when the system tries to bury you. And that courage was about to transform a courtroom humiliation into a viral, history-making moment. And it was precisely that fire which Thomas tried and failed to stamp out. The courtroom did not breathe. On one side sat Clarence Thomas, cloaked in the authority of decades, his gaze fixed downward as though the fine he had just declared was beyond dispute, beyond appeal, beyond question. On the other sat Jasmine Crockett, calm, still, but radiating a kind of quiet resistance that cameras could not help but capture. What began as silence quickly evolved into tension. Thomas's allies and clerks leaned in, whispering, some smirking, as if the matter was settled. $500 million. How could she possibly respond? The calculation was clear: strip her of resources, drown her in legal battles, force her into retreat. It was a tactic of arrogance, a flex of raw institutional muscle. But Crockett's silence was not retreat, it was loading. When she finally spoke, her words came measured, deliberate, have a cadence of someone who knew the weight of every syllable. $500 million, she repeated, her voice steady, echoing through the chamber. For daring to speak, for daring to question. That's the price of truth in America. The question hung in the air, and it was not rhetorical. It pierced the gallery, where reporters exchanged glances and audience members shifted in their seats. Even those accustomed to the sterile drama of legal proceedings felt something stirred. Thomas adjusted his glasses, unmoved, his expression carved in stone. Yet beneath that veneer of composure was a flicker at the smallest crack in his armor. Because Jasmine Crockett was not pleading. She was not begging for leniency. She was confronting. The escalation began, as Thomas leaned into legal jargon, citing precedent and procedure. Crockett leaned into moral clarity. A man who accepts gifts from billionaires lectures me about accountability? She countered, her words slicing sharper than any statute. A justice who turns his back on ethics now demands to bankrupt a sitting member of Congress for speaking truth to power. The courtroom shifted. Reporters' pens scribbled furiously, cameras zoomed closer. The balance of the room was tilting. Thomas, unaccustomed to being challenged so directly, bristled. His rebuttals grew colder, sharper, almost defensive. This is not about politics, Congresswoman, he said, voice clipped. This is about consequences for overstepping boundaries. But Crockett didn't let the framing stand. Boundaries? She shot back. The only boundary I crossed was daring to speak where silence was expected. If that carries a $500 million price tag, then the fine is not against me, it's against democracy itself. Gasps rippled through the chamber. What had started as a legal exchange was now a moral battlefield. The escalation wasn't just between two individuals. It was between two worlds, one built on secrecy, wealth, and unchecked privilege, the other fueled by raw truth, resilience, and the audacity to stand tall against giants. Every word Crockett spoke chipped away at the illusion of Thomas's unshakable authority, and every retort Thomas attempted revealed his unease, the cracks widening for all to see. Social media, already ablaze with the $500 million headline, now had fuel for a second wave. Clips of Crockett's calm defiance began circulating in real time. She's not backing down. Look at Thomas squirm. This is history in the making. And inside the chamber, the pressure mounted. The temperature rose with every exchange, the air thick with the electricity of confrontation. It was no longer just a fine, no longer just a ruling. It was a duel, one man's attempt to assert dominance against one woman's refusal to surrender it. And then, as the tension reached its peak, Jasmine Crockett leaned forward, her voice calm but resonant, carrying across the chamber with the gravity of a verdict. You can throw numbers at me, Justice Thomas, you can try to bury me under your arrogance. But remember this, I've faced worse than a fine. I faced silence. And silence never broke me. Do you really think you will? The room went still. Cameras clicked. Reporters froze. Even Thomas's allies shifted uneasily. Because in that moment, the dual hat turned other hunter was no longer in control. But then came the moment nobody expected, her counter-strike. The chamber had grown tense, charged like the air before a thunderstorm. Clarence Thomas leaned back, expecting that his gavel, his fine, his sheer institutional power had already won the day. But Jasmine Crockett wasn't just waiting for her turn to speak. She was building the silence into a weapon. And then she struck. $500 million. She began again, her voice calm but heavy with precision. Do you know what that means where I come from? That's not a number. That's a message. That's every little girl who dreams of becoming more than what the world told her she could be. Hearing, sit down, shut up, don't even try. The words didn't just echo, they landed. Each syllable cut through the marble chamber like it was glass. Thomas shuffled his papers, his jaw tightening. But Crockett wasn't looking at him anymore. She was speaking to the gallery, to the cameras, to the millions already watching online. $500 million, that's more than the life savings of entire communities combined. That's more than the schools in my district are funded in a decade. And yet, somehow, I'm supposed to believe this is about a boundaries number. This is about fear. Your fear. Justice Thomas gasps, a ripple through the room. She had just said it out loud, without flinching. The kind of statement politicians danced around, softened, dressed in legalese. Crockett delivered it raw. She turned her gaze back toward Thomas, her tone sharpening. Fear of what happens when people like me don't stay in the boxes you built. Fear of women who refuse to be silent. Fear of a country that looks less like your past and more like our future. Reporters scribbled furiously. Phones lit up across the gallery. Already, snippets of her words were going viral. Hashtags multiplied. Fear of Crockett. Truth over power. Thomas exposed. But Crockett wasn't done. Let's talk about accountability, she continued, her voice rising now, fueled not by anger but by conviction. Because I didn't ride on a billionaire's jet. I didn't vacation on yachts while pretending to serve the people. I didn't bend rulings to benefit the rich who fund my lifestyle. I came here with one thing, my word. My word to the people who trusted me to fight for them. And no fine, no ruling, no threat can strip me of that. The room shifted again. The power dynamic was cracking, tilting, and everyone could feel it. Even Thomas, normally unflappable, adjusted uncomfortably in his seat. Crockett pressed forward, her cadence now deliberate, hammering each point like nails into the coffin of his authority. You think this fine silences me? Number. All you've done is put a microphone in my hand. One I didn't ask for but one I will use. Because the truth you're afraid of is bigger than me, bigger than this chamber, bigger than you. The crowd murmured. A few claps even slipped through before being hushed by officials. Her tone softened, but the edge of defiance remained. When I was a public defender, I represented people who walked into courtrooms already defeated. People who thought the system would swallow them whole. And do you know what I told them? I told them, stand tall, even if they tried to make you small. Stand tall because your story matters, even if they act like it doesn't. Stand tall because dignity can't be fined, can't be jailed, can't be stripped away. And today, I'm taking my own advice. The line struck like lightning. Phones buzzed with texts. Did you hear that? Replay it. Social media feeds erupted with clips. Dignity can't be fined was instantly emblazoned across memes, tweets, TikTok edits. The phrase had become her rallying cry. Thomas tried to interject, his tone sharp. This is not about dignity, Congresswoman, but Crockett cut him off, her voice rising above his. It's always about dignity. Always. Because without it, justice is just a mask for control. The chamber ordained not with noise, but with an energy that every single person could feel vibrating in their bones. Even those who had come expecting her defeat were leaning forward, unable to look away. And then, the mic drop moment. Crockett leaned in, her voice low but cutting, every word deliberate, You can put $500 million on my back, Justice Thomas. You can try to weigh me down with the gold of your benefactors. But let me tell you something, I don't carry that weight alone. I carry every voice that ever refused to bow to corruption. I carry every community you've tried to overlook. I carry America, the real America. The one that doesn't get invited onto yachts. And we don't break silence. Pure, unbroken silence. Reporters froze mid-sentence. Cameras captured Thomas's face, pale, unreadable, yet shaken in a way no gavel could disguise. For the first time, it wasn't Crockett who looked small against the marble and the robes. It was him. And then, as if the silence itself was punctuation, Crockett leaned back, folded her hands, and said only, "So fine me. Do your worst. History will remember who spoke the truth." That was it. That was the blow. The mic drop so devastating it didn't need volume, only resonance. The chamber erupted, not in applause. Decorum still held, but in a restless energy that could not be contained. Phones buzzed. Reporters rushed for exits to file stories. Online, clips of Crockett's words were already trending in over a dozen hashtags, her phrases splintering into slogans for protest signs and profile bios. Clarence Thomas sat still, but the tremor in his hands betrayed what his expression tried to conceal. He had thrown $500 million at her, but she had thrown something back, a truth, unshakable and undeniable, and it landed harder than any ruling. And as her words rippled across the nation, the realization began to dawn. This wasn't just Crockett's counterattack. It was the start of a wave he couldn't control. And as her words echoed, the ripple effect began a broken bar. The echo of Jasmine Crockett's words hadn't even faded from the chamber before the ripple began. It started small, a murmur in the gallery, a buzz among reporters, the rapid-fire tapping of keys as journalists rushed to file what they knew was not just another courtroom drama, but history unfolding in real time. And then it exploded. By the time Crockett stepped out of the courthouse, the world outside had already transformed. Protesters had gathered spontaneously, some holding hastily made signs scrawled with her words, "Dignity can't be fined." Others simply chanted her name, a rhythmic chorus that rolled down the steps like thunder. News cameras jostled for space, their red lights glowing as anchors delivered live hits to audiences glued to their screens. On Twitter, the moment had detonated. #StandWithCrockett hit 1 million mentions within an hour. A clip of her saying "History will remember who spoke the truth" was looped endlessly, set to dramatic music, remixed into TikTok edits, shared across Instagram Reels. Young activists flooded timelines with her words. Memes cast Thomas as a bloated cartoon king weighed down by gold, while Crockett stood defiantly with the microphone, small but unshaken. And it wasn't just the grassroots. Commentators across the political spectrum were weighing in. Progressive pundits called it the mic drop heard around the world. Even some centrist commentators admitted the fine was an overreach that reeked of retaliation. Celebrities chimed in. An Oscar-winning actress tweeted, "Dignity can't be fined." Jasmine Crockett, "You are the voice we needed today." Musicians sampled her words into beats that racked up thousands of listens overnight. On cable news, panels dissected every angle. Clips of Clarence Thomas shifting uncomfortably as Crockett spoke played on repeat, side by side with Crockett's fiery stare. One commentator declared, "That wasn't just a rebuttal. That was a takedown." She didn't just survive the fine, she turned it into a weapon. But beyond the memes, the hashtags, and the hot takes, something deeper was happening. For ordinary Americans, watching Crockett refuse to break was more than political theater. It was validation. People who had felt invisible, silenced, or powerless saw themselves in her defiance. In barbershops and cafes, in classrooms and living rooms, her words became conversation starters. Teachers replayed the clip for students learning about courage in civics class. Community organizers referenced her in meetings as proof that standing tall mattered, even when the system tried to crush you. Meanwhile, on the steps of the courthouse, Crockett herself barely paused to bask in the moment. She knew the cameras were hungry, the crowd electric, but her message remained steady. "This was never about me. she told the microphones shoved in her face. This was about justice. This was about dignity. And that's something no fine can ever take away. Her voice, unwavering even amid chaos, only deepened the contrast. Where Thomas appeared rigid, defensive, even rattled, Crockett projected clarity and calm. She wasn't just fighting back. She was embodying the very principle she had spoken of, standing tall. And with every passing hour, the shockwaves spread wider. Editorial boards began questioning Thomas's judgment. Law professors debated whether the ruling had any legitimate legal basis or was simply a political hit. Hashtags multiplied. #Crockett vs Thomas, #Truth on Trial, #Justice over Power. A grassroots fundraising campaign in her name raised millions in a single night, a symbolic show of support, even though the fine itself was absurd and destined to face appeal. What Thomas had intended as a crushing blow had transformed into a national rallying cry. His attempt to silence had only amplified. His bid to intimidate had only inspired. The fine that was supposed to bury her had instead resurrected something far more dangerous to him, a movement. And as the sun set that evening, one headline summed it up best: she faced $500 million and made Clarence Thomas look small. But the story wasn't over, because beyond the memes and their marches, beyond the trending hashtags and celebrity endorsements, Jasmine Crockett was preparing to do something even more powerful. She wasn't content with just winning the moment. She was ready to turn it into a lesson. But what mattered most wasn't just the memes, it was the moral lesson she left behind a broken bar the next morning. As the country was still buzzing from the spectacle, Jasmine Crockett did something that silenced even her fiercest critics. She didn't run to the morning shows. She didn't bask in the spotlight of her newfound viral fame. Instead, she stood behind a simple wooden podium in her district, surrounded not by celebrities or political elites, but by ordinary people: teachers, nurses, small business owners, students. Her voice was calm, steady, and almost softer than the fiery cadence from the day before. But that calmness carried more power than shouting ever could. "Yesterday," she began, "a man tried to put a price on my dignity. $500 million, $500 million, as if dignity were something you could buy, sell, or bankrupt. But what I want every person listening to me right now to understand is this: your worth is not for sale. Your dignity is not for sale. Your voice is not for sale." The crowd erupted, clapping, some wiping away tears. This wasn't about legal maneuvering anymore, it was about principle. And Crockett was doing what great leaders do in moments of trial, transforming personal attack into universal truth. She continued, "I didn't speak yesterday just for myself. I spoke for every immigrant who's been told they don't belong. For every woman who's been told she's too loud, too angry, too ambitious. For every worker who's been silenced. Every activist who's been threatened. Every student who's been told to keep their head down. What they don't understand is that America was built by people who refused to stay quiet." Each sentence struck like a hammer. But it wasn't anger, it was clarity. Crockett's words gave voice to what millions had been feeling but hadn't been able to articulate. She raised her hand slightly, as if cutting through the noise of history itself. "The lesson here is simple. Power can fine you, threaten you, try to bury you. But the truth always rises. And when one person stands tall, it gives others the courage to do the same." In living rooms across America, families nodded along. In union halls, workers cheered. On social media, clips of her speech racked up millions of views in hours. But perhaps the most striking reaction came from the very place she had been attacked, Washington. Even some of her fiercest opponents were forced to admit off the record, of course, that Thomas's move had backfired. His attempt to silence her had only made her stronger. And in that moment, Crockett leaned into the larger story. "This is not the end of a courtroom drama," she said. "This is a chapter in America's long story of justice. And if there is anything we must remember, it's this: dignity is greater than hate. Service is greater than corruption. Justice is greater than power." Her words drew the arc back to the universal beyond herself. Beyond Thomas, beyond even the $500 million absurdity. It was about America itself. and the choice it faced, to be ruled by fear or lifted by courage. She closed with a line that would be replayed for years: "You can put a price tag on a building, on a car, even on a lawsuit. But you can never put a price tag on the human spirit. And that, Clarence Thomas, is why we will win." The crowd leapt to its feet, a standing ovation not just for her, but for the values she embodied. It was cinematic, yes, but it was also deeply real. And as the applause roared, the narrative was sealed. Jasmine Crockett had taken a weapon meant to destroy her and forged it into a torch that others could carry. But her story wasn't finished, because even as she brought the nation to tears, she was about to turn that emotion into action. A broken bar and her final call to the people would ignite something even bigger. The cameras lingered on Jasmine Crockett as she stepped away from the podium, but her presence still filled the room. This was no longer about a courtroom or a fine. It was about something bigger, a movement. She paused, scanning the crowd, her tone shifting into something almost intimate, as if she were speaking directly to every viewer on the other side of the screen. Yesterday was about me, today is about us, and tomorrow is about what we do together. The audience leaned in. You've seen the headlines. You've seen the arrogance of unchecked power. But what you've also seen is this: when one person refuses to bow, it gives millions permission to stand. That is what scares them most. Not me, not my words, but the idea that you, watching this right now, will realize your own power. Her words hung in the air like electricity. So here is my call to you: don't just watch this moment. Be part of it. Share it. Talk about it. Teach it to your kids. Stand up in your own way, wherever you are. Because dignity is not mine alone. It belongs to every one of us. And no fine, no threat, no intimidation can take that away. A murmur of agreement rolled through the crowd. Some lifted their phones, live streaming her words directly to their own networks, amplifying the message in real time. Crockett smiled, just slightly, but with the weight of conviction. Subscribe, share, speak. Not for me, for justice, for dignity, for America. And with that, she walked off stage, not defeated, not diminished, but elevated. Because in the end, Clarence Thomas's $500 million fine hadn't silenced Jasmine Crockett. It had only made her voice impossible to ignore.